Why did one boatswain's mate destroy 65 enemy boats and become a legend? How did a routine patrol turn into the deadliest single engagement in riverine warfare history? What made James E. Williams the most decorated enlisted man in US Navy history? And how did two small patrol boats survive 5 hours of continuous combat against an entire enemy fleet? You're going to hear all that and more through the extraordinary story of the Battle of the Mekong Delta. Let's begin. On October 31st, 1966, the morning sun burned through the humid air of the Mekong Delta as boatswain's mate, First Class James Elliott Williams, prepared his patrol boat for another mission. At 31 years old, Williams was a career sailor from South Carolina who had spent over a decade in the Navy. He stood average height but carried himself with the confidence of someone who had proven himself in combat many times before. This day would be different from all the others. This day would see the most devastating single patrol boat engagement of the entire Vietnam War. Williams commanded PBR-105, a 31-foot patrol boat made of fiberglass. The designation PBR stood for Patrol Boat River, and these vessels were the workhorses of Operation Game Warden, the Navy's effort to control the Mekong Delta's vast network of waterways. His boat was armed with twin 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns mounted in a forward turret, a single 50 caliber gun at the stern, and an M60 7.62mm machine gun. It also carried a Mark 19 40mm automatic grenade launcher. For a boat weighing only 8 tons with a crew of 4 men, it was heavily armed. But the PBR's real advantages were speed and maneuverability. Powered by twin diesel engines driving water jet propulsion systems, the boat could reach speeds of 25 to 30 knots and turn on a dime in the narrow channels of the Delta. The Mekong Delta was a world unlike any other battlefield in Vietnam. It was a vast labyrinth of rivers, canals, streams and swamps covering roughly 15,000 square miles in the southernmost part of South Vietnam. The Mekong River itself split into multiple branches as it approached the South China Sea, creating what the Vietnamese called Song Kieu Long, the River of 9 Dragons. These waterways were highways for both sides of the war. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, the rivers and canals provided routes to move troops, weapons, ammunition, and supplies from Cambodia into South Vietnam, supporting the insurgency throughout the region. For the Americans and South Vietnamese, controlling these waterways was essential to cutting off enemy supply lines and preventing infiltration. Operation Game Warden had been launched in December 1965 specifically to address this challenge. The Navy's Task Force 116 was responsible for patrolling over 4,000 miles of rivers and canals with a fleet of patrol boats, helicopters, and supporting craft. It was dangerous, exhausting work. PBR crews faced constant threats from multiple directions. The vegetation along the riverbanks was so dense that enemy fighters could position themselves within yards of the water and remain invisible until they opened fire. Ambushes could come from either bank simultaneously. Rocket-propelled grenades could be fired at point-blank range, giving crews almost no time to react. The Viet Cong would string wires across rivers at throat height to decapitate sailors manning the guns. They planted mines in the waterways that could vaporize the lightweight fiberglass hulls, and they attacked at night when the darkness gave them every advantage. The casualty rate for PBR crews was brutal. Statistics showed that 1 in 3 sailors serving on patrol boats were killed or wounded during their tours. The boats offered no armor protection. Crew members were exposed to enemy fire, protected only by flak jackets that would stop shrapnel but not rifle rounds. When a boat was hit by an RPG or struck a mine, the fiberglass hull would shatter, and sailors had only seconds to abandon ship before it sank. Many didn't make it. Those who did often found themselves in water infested with leeches, swimming for their lives while enemy fighters continued shooting from the banks. Yet despite the danger, men like James Williams volunteered for PBR duty. Some were drawn by the independence and responsibility. Unlike larger ships where hundreds of sailors each performed narrow specialized tasks, a PBR crew was a tight-knit team where every man's actions mattered. The boat captain had tremendous autonomy, making tactical decisions in real time without waiting for orders from distant commanders. There was a sense of purpose in the mission. The PBR crews knew that their patrols directly impacted the enemy's ability to move supplies and reinforcements. Every weapons cache they discovered, every enemy sampan they destroyed, every infiltration route they closed made a difference. James Williams had earned his position through years of demonstrated competence and courage. He had joined the Navy in 1947 at age 12 by lying about his age, desperate to escape poverty in rural South Carolina. When the Navy discovered the deception, they discharged him. Undeterred, Williams re-enlisted as soon as he was legally old enough and began building a career. He served in Korea. He served on various ships and shore assignments, always volunteering for the most challenging duties. By the time he arrived in Vietnam in 1966, he had nearly 2 decades of naval experience. His superiors recognized his skills and gave him command of his own PBR. Williams ran his boat with professionalism and discipline. He trained his crew constantly, running them through emergency procedures until every man could perform his role by instinct, even under fire. He maintained his weapons, meticulously, personally inspecting every gun and ensuring ammunition was clean and ready. He studied the waterways, learning the channels, the villages, the areas where enemy activity was common, and he led from the front, never asking his men to take risks he wasn't willing to take himself. On this October morning, Williams commanded a 2-boat patrol. His PBR-105 was accompanied by PBR-105, commanded by another experienced boat captain. The 2 boats would operate together, providing mutual support if they encountered trouble. The mission briefing that morning had indicated intelligence reports of enemy activity near the Cambodian border. A section of the Mekong River in that area had seen increased enemy traffic recently. Command wanted a patrol to investigate and interdict any enemy movement. As the 2 boats departed their base and headed upriver, Williams and his crew went through their standard procedures. Gunners test-fired their weapons, ensuring everything functioned properly. The engine room crew monitored the diesels and water jets. The radio operator confirmed communications with base and with the helicopter gunships that could provide support if needed. Williams stood at the helm, his eyes constantly scanning the riverbanks, the water ahead, the sky above. Years of experience had taught him to notice things that seemed out of place. The absence of fishermen who normally worked these waters, the unusual quietness of villages they passed, the way birds took flight from the trees suggesting something had disturbed them. The patrol moved steadily upriver into increasingly remote territory. The channels narrowed. The vegetation grew thicker. This was territory where the Viet Cong operated with relative freedom, far from American and South Vietnamese bases. As they approached the area where intelligence had indicated enemy activity, Williams increased his alertness. He signaled the 2nd boat to maintain proper spacing, close enough to support each other, but far enough apart that one enemy ambush couldn't catch both boats simultaneously. Then, as the boats rounded a bend in the river, Williams saw something that made his blood run cold. Ahead of them, stretching across the waterway and continuing around the next bend, was an armada of enemy vessels. Not a handful of sampans or a dozen junks, but an entire fleet. Williams would later count 65 separate vessels, sampans, junks, and military watercraft. It was clearly a major resupply operation, moving weapons, ammunition, and troops from Cambodia into South Vietnam. The enemy had grown bold, operating in daylight in such large numbers. They likely believed they were far enough from American forces to be safe from interference. In that instant, Williams faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. Every tactical manual, every bit of conventional wisdom, said that when outnumbered 30-1, you call for backup and withdraw. You report the contact, mark the position, and let superior forces deal with it. No one would have faulted Williams for breaking contact. His 2 small boats against 65 enemy vessels was suicide. The enemy would have heavy weapons. They would have hundreds of fighters. They were spread across such a large area that his boats couldn't possibly engage them all effectively. But Williams also knew that if he withdrew, the enemy fleet would scatter. By the time reinforcements arrived, most of these vessels would have disappeared into side channels and hidden waterways. The massive quantity of weapons and supplies they carried would reach Viet Cong units throughout the Delta. The opportunity to strike a significant blow against the enemy logistical network would be lost. James Williams made his decision in seconds. He would attack. He keyed his radio and spoke tersely to the commander of the 2nd PBR. "We're going in. Follow my lead. Hit them with everything." Opening fire with every weapon on both boats, Williams charged directly into the enemy fleet. The forward twin 50 caliber guns began hammering, their deep, rhythmic pounding sending tracer rounds streaking across the water. The gunner traversed the turret, walking his fire across the nearest sampans. The heavy slugs from the 50 caliber rounds were devastating against the wooden boats. Hulls splintered, superstructures disintegrated, water sprayed up where rounds skipped off the surface before punching through hulls below the waterline. The M60 machine gunner opened up, adding his higher rate of fire to the barrage. 7.62mm rounds raked across the decks of the vessels. The grenadier began lobbing 40mm rounds from the Mark 19, high explosive grenades that detonated among the clustered boats with sharp cracks, sending shrapnel scything through the air. For perhaps 30 seconds the enemy was caught completely by surprise. They had not expected 2 American patrol boats to be this far upriver. They certainly hadn't expected those boats to attack. Then the Viet Cong recovered and returned fire. Suddenly the air was filled with bullets coming from dozens of directions. AK-47 assault rifles barked from the sampans. Heavy machine guns on some of the larger vessels opened up with slower, deeper reports. And then Williams saw the characteristic puff of white smoke and backblast that meant someone had just fired a rocket-propelled grenade at his boat. "RPG incoming!" he shouted, throwing the helm hard over. The PBR responded instantly, the water jet propulsion allowing it to change direction without the lag that propeller-driven boats experienced. The rocket-propelled grenades screamed past where the boat had been a second earlier and exploded harmlessly in the water behind them. But already another RPG was incoming from a different direction. Williams swerved again, his hands moving on the wheel with practiced precision, his mind processing threats from multiple directions simultaneously. His forward gunner, Engineer-Man Second Class John D. Davis, had been struck by enemy fire in the opening seconds of the engagement. A bullet had hit him in the arm, spinning him around and knocking him partially out of the gun turret. But Davis grabbed the gun mount, pulled himself back into position, and kept firing despite the wound, blood running down his arm and mixing with the oil and brass casings littering the gun tub. The second PBR charged in beside Williams, its own guns blazing. The 2 boats worked in concert, Williams having trained with the other boat captain extensively. They positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire while minimizing their exposure to enemy guns. Williams would sweep in close to the enemy vessels on one side, while the second boat engaged from another angle. Then they would reverse positions, keeping the enemy off balance, never allowing them to concentrate their fire effectively on either boat. The engagement was nothing like the textbook river patrols Williams had trained for. This was close-quarters chaos, boats swerving and dodging between enemy vessels, guns firing in all directions, explosions sending up geysers of water, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Williams navigated by instinct, his eyes constantly moving, identifying threats, picking targets, plotting courses through gaps in the enemy formation. The enemy vessels began trying to scatter, heading for the riverbanks where they could beach their boats and escape into the jungle, or turning into narrow side channels where the PBRs couldn't follow. Williams couldn't allow that. He keyed his radio to the second boat. "Cut them off, don't let them reach the banks." The 2 patrol boats increased speed, racing to intercept fleeing vessels before they could escape. Williams pulled alongside a large junk that was making for the shore. His gunners poured fire into it at point-blank range. The junk was carrying ammunition, and when a tracer round found the cargo, the entire vessel exploded in a massive fireball that sent debris spinning through the air. The explosion was so close that Williams felt the heat wash over him, and fragments of burning wood splashed into the water all around his boat. Another junk tried ramming Williams' PBR, its helmsman desperately trying to disable the American boat by crushing it against the riverbank. Williams saw the maneuver developing and reacted instantly, reversing his engines and backing away while his stern gunner hammered the approaching junk with 50 caliber fire. The junk's bow splintered under the fusillade, and it veered off course, running aground on a sandbar. Enemy fighters on the riverbanks had begun firing at the PBRs as well, adding to the incoming fire from the boats. Williams could see muzzle flashes in the tree line, and bullets were striking the water around his boat and pinging off the metal components of the gun, mounts. He called out target positions to his gunners. "Tree line, left bank 100 meters. The M60 gunner swiveled and opened up on the indicated position, sending a stream of tracers into the vegetation. Ammunition was becoming a concern. The PBRs had departed on what was supposed to be a routine patrol, and while they carried substantial ammunition loads, they hadn't anticipated a prolonged engagement. Williams could see his ammunition cans emptying, He radioed his base. "This is PBR-105. Heavy contact. Multiple enemy vessels. Request immediate resupply and air support." The response came back quickly. Helicopter gunships were being scrambled. A resupply helicopter was being loaded, but it would take time for them to arrive. Williams would have to make his current ammunition last. He changed tactics, becoming more selective with his targets. Instead of engaging every enemy vessel, he focused on the ones carrying the heaviest weapons or the largest quantities of visible supplies. He directed his gunners' fire, calling out specific targets. "Sampan at 2 o'clock. Looks like weapons crates. Forward guns, engage." The gunners would fire controlled bursts rather than continuous streams, making every round count. The enemy was adapting too. Some vessels had begun using smoke pots, creating clouds of white and grey smoke that obscured the battlefield. Others were firing their weapons from behind the cover of larger vessels, using the junks and sampans as shields. The Viet Cong commanders were trying to organize a coordinated response, concentrating their fire on one PBR at a time in hopes of overwhelming it. Williams recognized the danger immediately. He maneuvered his boat to stay in motion, never presenting a stationary target, always keeping enemy gunners guessing where he would be next. He used the terrain to his advantage, positioning his boat so that the bulk of enemy vessels were between him and the most dangerous threats, forcing them to risk hitting their own craft if they fired at him. 20 minutes into the engagement, Williams heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors. 2 UH-1 Bravo Huey gunships came roaring in low over the river, their door gunners already firing. Williams keyed his radio. "Game Warden Alpha, this is PBR-105. Targets scattered along the river. Multiple sampans and junks attempting to flee into side channels. Need you to cut them off." The helicopter pilots acknowledged and began their attack runs. The gunships carried door-mounted M60 machine guns and could fire rockets from their stub wings. They made diving passes over the enemy fleet, their weapons blazing. The effect was devastating. Caught between the helicopters attacking from above and the PBRs attacking from the water, the enemy had no effective response. Several vessels attempted to fire back at the helicopters with automatic weapons, but this only revealed their positions to Williams, who directed his gunners to engage them. The resupply helicopter arrived soon after, a larger Huey configured as a cargo carrier. Williams maneuvered his PBR to a relatively clear section of water, and the helicopter came in low, hovering just feet above the boat. Crew members began tossing out ammunition cans, cases of grenades and fresh barrels for the machine guns. Williams' crew grabbed the supplies and immediately began reloading their weapons, all while Williams kept the boat moving to avoid becoming an easy target. The second PBR pulled alongside for its own resupply. Both boats were now battle-damaged, their hulls pockmarked with bullet holes, their superstructures scarred by shrapnel. But they were still operational, and with fresh ammunition aboard, Williams was ready to continue the fight. For 5 hours, the battle raged across miles of river. Williams and his small force destroyed one enemy vessel after another, methodically working through the enemy fleet. Some vessels he sank with sustained fire from his machine guns. Others he left burning after grenades struck their cargoes of fuel or ammunition. Some he disabled, holding them below the waterline so they settled into the river bottom. A few he captured intact after their crews abandoned them. The helicopters continued providing support throughout, making attack runs, calling in additional air support, and even dropping more ammunition when the PBRs ran low again. Williams coordinated with them constantly, directing them to specific targets, warning them of enemy anti-aircraft positions, ensuring their attacks were synchronized with his own movements. The enemy fought desperately. They knew they were being systematically destroyed, but they had nowhere to retreat. The PBRs blocked their escape downriver. The helicopters cut off their escape to the banks. Many Viet Cong fighters chose to fight to the death rather than surrender. Others dove into the water and tried swimming to shore, but the current was strong and many didn't make it. By early afternoon, the firing began to slacken. Williams had accounted for the destruction of 65 enemy vessels. 65. Some were completely destroyed, blown apart by explosions or burned to the waterline. Others were sinking, their hulls so riddled with holes that they could no longer stay afloat. Still others were beached or grounded, abandoned by their crews, too damaged to be seaworthy. The river was littered with debris, pieces of shattered sampans, floating cargo, bodies. The water was slicked with oil from ruptured fuel tanks. Smoke rose from multiple burning vessels, creating a pall that hung over the battlefield. Williams conducted a quick assessment of his own force. His PBR was heavily damaged but still operational. Every square foot of the hull had been hit by something, bullets or shrapnel. The gun mounts were scarred and dented. The windscreen was completely shot away. Blood stained the deck where Davis had been wounded, though the engineman was still at his gun, refusing evacuation until the fight was over. The second PBR was in similar condition, its crew exhausted but unbroken. The intelligence value of what Williams had just accomplished was immense. The destroyed fleet had been carrying enough weapons and ammunition to supply Viet Cong operations throughout the Delta for weeks or months. The loss would force the enemy to find alternative routes, which would be more dangerous and less efficient. And the psychological impact was significant. The Viet Cong had believed the waterways were safe for large-scale movements. Williams had shattered that assumption. But Williams wasn't done. As the helicopters circled overhead and more American forces began arriving to secure the area, Williams took his battered patrol boats and began systematically searching the destroyed vessels and the nearby riverbanks. His crews boarded abandoned sampans and junks, confiscating weapons and supplies. They found AK-47 rifles, machine guns, cases of ammunition, mortars, medical supplies, communications equipment, and rice. The sheer quantity of material confirmed this had been a major enemy operation. They also took prisoners. Dozens of Viet Cong fighters had survived, either swimming to shore or surrendering when their vessels were destroyed. These prisoners provided valuable intelligence about enemy plans and movements in the region. By late afternoon, when Williams finally turned his boats back toward base, he had been in continuous combat for over 5 hours. His crew was exhausted, their hearing damaged by hours of gunfire, their hands blistered from handling hot gun barrels, their bodies running on adrenaline long after physical reserves had been depleted. But they had won. They had taken on an enemy force 30 times their size and decisively defeated it. When Williams returned to base, word of the engagement had already spread. Senior officers were waiting to debrief him. Intelligence analysts wanted details on everything he had seen. Medical personnel rushed to treat the wounded, especially Davis, who had continued fighting for hours despite his injury. As Williams climbed off his boat and looked back at the shattered, bullet-riddled hull that had carried him through the battle, he felt the weight of what had happened beginning to sink in. The official after-action reports confirmed the destruction of 65 enemy vessels, and estimated hundreds of enemy casualties, killed or wounded. It was, by any measure, the most successful single patrol boat engagement of the entire Vietnam War. No other PBR crew had come close to inflicting such damage on the enemy in a single action. In the days and weeks following, the magnitude of Williams' achievement became clear. The enemy logistical network in that region had been severely disrupted. Viet Cong units that had been counting on those supplies had to operate with reduced capabilities. The enemy became much more cautious about moving large convoys on the rivers, breaking them into smaller groups that were easier to conceal but also less efficient. The psychological effect on enemy morale was significant as well. The Viet Cong had learned that even deep in what they considered their own territory, they were not safe from American attack. For his actions that day, James E. Williams was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation made its way up through the chain of command, with each level of review confirming that Williams' actions met the highest standards of heroism. On May 14, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson presented the Medal of Honor to Williams at the White House. The citation read, in part, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Boatswain's mate Williams was serving as boat captain and patrol officer aboard River Patrol Boat 105, accompanied by another patrol boat when the patrol was suddenly taken under heavy small arms and automatic weapons fire from a Viet Cong battalion deployed on the riverbank. Boatswain's mate Williams immediately ordered the fire returned and directed the maneuvers of his patrol in pursuit of the enemy. When the initial contact developed into a savage firefight as the enemy force of more than 50 sampans and 7 junks, augmented by heavy automatic weapons fire from ashore, sought to escape, Boatswain's mate Williams inspired his men to press the attack in the face of a numerically superior enemy force. The Medal of Honor made Williams the most decorated enlisted man in US Navy history. Combined with his other awards, which included the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, 3 Bronze Stars with Combat 5, the Purple Heart, and numerous other decorations, his record was unmatched. But Williams remained humble about his achievements. In interviews, he always credited his crew and the helicopter crews that supported him. He emphasized that he had simply done his job, that any naval officer in his position would have done the same. Williams continued serving in Vietnam, returning for additional tours despite having earned the right to safer assignments. He believed in the mission and felt a responsibility to the men serving under him. He trained new PBR crews, passing on the lessons he had learned. His presence on the rivers of Vietnam became legendary. Enemy forces knew his boat and tried to avoid him. American forces took confidence from knowing he was out there. But the war took its toll. The stress of continuous combat, the loss of friends and comrades, the brutal conditions of riverine warfare all wore on Williams. He struggled with what today would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. After the war, he had difficulty adjusting to peacetime Navy life. The bureaucracy, the routine, the distance from the front lines all felt wrong to someone who had spent years making life and death decisions every day. Williams eventually retired from the Navy after 26 years of service. He returned to South Carolina, trying to build a civilian life. But the transition was difficult. He worked various jobs, but never seemed to find his place. The man who'd been so confident and capable in combat struggled with civilian society. He dealt with his demons privately, rarely speaking about his experiences except to other veterans who understood. On October 13th, 1999, James Elliott Williams died at age 63. He was buried with full military honours at Arlington National Cemetery. His funeral was attended by former crew members, fellow Medal of Honor recipients, and senior Navy officers who came to pay their respects to a genuine American hero. The Navy named a destroyer in his honor. USS James E. Williams, DDG-95, was commissioned in 2004 and continues to serve the fleet today, carrying the name of the sailor who exemplified courage, skill, and dedication to duty. The story of Williams' engagement on October 31, 1966, is studied at the Naval Academy and in Navy professional military education courses as an example of decisive leadership, tactical brilliance, and courage under fire. The battle demonstrated that numerical superiority means nothing if leadership and firepower are properly applied. Williams understood that his boat's advantages in speed, maneuverability, and concentrated firepower could offset the enemy's advantage in numbers if he was aggressive and decisive. The engagement also validated the patrol boat concept. Some critics had questioned whether small, lightly armoured fiberglass boats could survive in combat against a determined enemy. Williams proved they could not only survive but dominate the battlefield when properly employed by skilled crews. The Battle of the Mekong Delta, as it came to be known, had strategic implications beyond the immediate tactical victory. It forced enemy planners to reconsider how they moved supplies through the delta. They could no longer send large, efficient convoys during daylight hours. They had to break shipments into smaller loads, move at night, use more circuitous routes, and accept greater losses to infiltration. This increased the cost and reduced the efficiency of their logistics, contributing to the overall pressure on enemy operations throughout the region. For the men who served on patrol boats in Vietnam, Williams became an inspiration and a legend. His example showed that PBR crews could take the fight to the enemy and win, even against overwhelming odds. His leadership style, combining professionalism with aggressive tactics, became the model for riverine operations. And his willingness to continue serving, returning for additional tours, demonstrated a level of dedication that earned deep respect from those who served with and after him. Today, more than 50 years after that October morning when Williams charged into an enemy fleet, his story continues to be told. It reminds us that individual courage and decisive leadership can change the course of battles. It shows that even when outnumbered 30-1, determination and skill can overcome numerical superiority, and it honors the memory of a sailor who exemplified the Navy's core values of honor, courage, and commitment. James E. Williams destroyed 65 enemy vessels in a single mission, because when he saw an opportunity to strike a devastating blow against the enemy, he didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate the odds or wait for orders or consider the personal risk. He attacked, trusting in his training, his crew, his boat, and his own judgment. That decision, made in seconds, resulted in one of the most significant tactical victories of the Riverine War. His story is a reminder that wars are won not just by grand strategies and massive operations, but by individual men and women making critical decisions in moments of crisis. Williams faced such a moment on that October day. His decision defined not just that battle, but his entire legacy. He chose to fight, and in doing so, he became a legend. That is why one Navy boat captain destroyed 65 enemy boats in a single mission, and that is why his story matters.